Do I need to test? It's on.
Test. Good morning. Happy October 5th.
Good morning, sir.
Is everybody live? Excellent. I'd like to call our work session to order. To view the meeting's presentation documents, please access Board Docs. The link to the Board Doc website can be found on via D38 website, www.lewispalmer.org, on the Board of Education meetings webpage. To view the live stream video of this meeting, please go to the Lewis Palmer District number 38 YouTube page. If you'll join me now, we can have a pledge of allegiance, which I'll lead. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Ms. Wood, would you call roll, please?
Here.
Here. Thank you. So let's just dive right in. Dr. Summers, B1. Priority 3, update, value our people, and commit to continuous growth.
Good morning, Board. Thank you all for joining us on this fine October morning. I'm going to actually position here, and I'm going to invite both Kristen Stieber and Kitty Overton up here with me. We will be co-presenting this morning on our Priority 3 deep dive, so you can follow along in the attached PDF version of this presentation. And I think we're all set. I'm going to test this one. This one sounds a little bit better. Okay, so actually, Kristen, let me see. Priority 3, valuing our people and committing to continuous growth. Most notably, this morning when we refer to our people, we will be referring to the outstanding staff of Lewis Palmer School District 38. So, as you might recall, when we first drafted our strategic plan, we identified 5 initiatives in alignment with Priority 3. The first of which is highlighted for you today and represents the primary source of what we'll be referring to as we work through this presentation. So developing sustainable and competitive compensation plans for teachers and all of our staff. I do not want to diminish the other 4. As you can see, some of the blue underlined language that exists within those other 4 aspects of this priority. Certainly we are referring to our culture in an effort to ensure clearly defined core values and shared commitments, which represents how we go about our work that yields high levels of employee performance, as well as how we support our staff, and how we also enhance employee recognition and appreciation opportunities. So I do want to just mention those as they are integral pieces of the type of district workplace culture that we are striving for. The best way for me to bottom line this is when our adults or employees are thriving, so will our children. But again, today we will be spending the bulk of our time analyzing the current state of our staff compensation. So we have been performing multiple studies behind the scenes here that we are excited to share with you in terms of the data that we are zooming in on, so to speak. And we see this as foundational information in the way that we work to make sense of this current state. as well as begin to explore options for consideration. So our goal with you this morning is to really share this analysis in a way that helps the board become informed. Some of this information you may be already quite familiar with. Other pieces may be somewhat new. We would like to engage in some dialogue around these topics so that you can ask some questions, that we can seek your feedback, validate that information which is essential for us to share with our community, as well as say we need to go a little bit deeper here, or it would be good if we are making sure that we include other pieces that may not be completely represented today. So in other words, this is really a work in progress, but we see this analysis being shared with and engaging our community in this conversation over the next few months. We see that community engagement piece not only as a function of Priority 5, but really how do we help create that sense of awareness and that deeper level of understanding around this current state. All of that then will feed the next steps in reference to how we co-develop our desired state. And we see that work occurring as we head into the winter, into the early spring. And then engaging our community, I refer to again, because this cannot be something that we work to create options and ultimately changes to without our community as partners in this process. So with that said, we've broken this presentation up into thirds. The first section will be led by Kitty, where we will just do some review of our current funding state in D38. Kristen will follow that up with some deeper data around our current employee data, what numbers of teachers we currently have, educational support staff, et cetera, et cetera. There's quite a bit of information there, and especially in light of the change from last year into this year in terms of new hires, folks that have left. What does all of that mean? How do we put that into context? And then the last section I will be finishing up with as far as the compensation facts and some figures for your consideration. So we actually have, I would say probably about 5 to 7 minutes worth of presentation mode, if you will, for each of those sections. And then we're anticipating questions and dialogue from that presentation. We don't want you to feel like you have to stop ahead of the question slides, but we did include some question reflection slides within the scope of this presentation. So we're excited to dive in to all of this with you. So I'm just going to set the context briefly here before handing it off to Kitty. We decided that it was important for us to put some of our funding data points, which you will see listed here under these 5 bullets in terms of per pupil revenue, mill levy and overrides, our total compensation of a mill really from the lens of the bond and the local mill override composition, how those total mill levy trends compare, as well as what those D38 trends in assessed value and mills also suggest. What we did in this process is we selected 8 neighboring or area school districts from nearby geographical areas. We have various sources for this data, so all of this can be verified through a variety of different tools, both through Calder Department of Education as well as other district websites. Certainly we're referring to our own internal records, but we're trying to ensure that all of this information is such that anybody could go and work to locate it and make sense of it. We're creating probably a next level of analysis that you wouldn't necessarily find as you just go to those individual websites directly. And with that said, I also wanted to just elevate those of you that know Kevin Smelker, who's been doing some contract work for us, was huge in helping us prepare a lot of this behind the scenes information. So we're excited to dive into all of that with you, and I'm going to hand it off to Kitty to take us where we're going next.
Dr. Somers, quick question.
Sure.
From a board perspective, how would you and your team like us to look at this data from a critical thinking standpoint, from an absorption standpoint, just to make sure that we're looking at this in a manner that helps the team?
So I would suggest, because each of the slides have quite a bit of information already included, that you really listen carefully to what's being shared as well as what's also on the slide. And certainly if there's something that just doesn't completely makes sense for you right at the moment, feel free to just ask a quick question. But if it looks pretty explainable, if you will, as we're going through that, and I think it would be good for us to get through as much of it as we can up to the section breaks that we've created. So I think he has the next 5 or 6 slides. So I want to give you flexibility. I don't want to tell you not to ask a question if you have it, but I think what you'll hear in the context of what we're sharing, quite a bit of analysis that's built in and around the data, if that makes sense. Does that help answer that question?
It sounds like, if I could summarize, you'd like us to be in absorption mode.
If you can be a sponge, Mr. Schwartz, that would be outstanding.
You have a lot of people in line in front of you for
Okay,
that one.
excellent. So without further ado.
Good morning. Good morning. Am I good? Can you hear me? All right. So as we start to engage the community, we wanted to be sure and create sort of a baseline understanding of what per pupil revenue is and how it's calculated in the state of Colorado. So each year in the state of Colorado, the Colorado legislature sets the base funding amount for all school districts within the state. That amount of funding is adjusted up or down according to these different factors for each school district. Okay. So the factors that we use to adjust our base funding are shown there, and then District 38's PPR for the current school year calculated out to 8501.45. That amount is then multiplied by the October pupil count to come up with total program funding. And this year's estimated total program funding is listed there at $55 million. It's also important to notice that there is a budget stabilization factor included, and we're going to get a little bit deeper into that on this next slide. Thank you. So the budget stabilization factor was implemented by the state of Colorado in 2009. This factor is a negative factor that's applied to our base funding amount and decreases the amount per student that we receive from the state and through our local community support. That amount of deduction for this school year is approximately $3.9 million. This data was shared with us recently by the Colorado School Finance Project, and it amounts to approximately $567 per student this year. Additionally notable on that is that since 2009, the amount of reduction to funding for District 38 alone amounts to over $66 million during that time frame. Bottom line, while we can't control the reality of the budget stabilization factor, this additional PPOR loss translates to substantial less revenue per pupil, and it impacts our bottom line ability to manage our own operations. Ultimately, we can't rely entirely on state funding to address our issues, and local school districts must make locally based decisions about how to best invest in our schools. This graphic shows a comparison with our neighboring school districts, the 8 that were selected. It breaks down our funding between our base funding amount, that 8501, that we just went over the calculation for, and then it shows the mill levy override portion that's added to our local funding. Sorry, just a second. So we're switching slides, so that 1605 is the MLO on top of, okay.
Per
Right.
pupil, as a function of $4 million, that was passed in 1999.
Right.
As
As you can see here, our total PPR ranks District 38 second to last among comparable neighboring districts. And it's also notable or relevant to mention that Falcon 49 currently has an initiative on the ballot to pass another mill levy override. If that initiative does pass, we will drop to last place among this comparison with these school districts.
Just a quick question of clarification. So in the blue bar there, those vary because of the budget stabilization factor. Is that correct?
Vary because of the base funding and then the additional weighted factors as a function of the state total program allocation.
Which does
Which also
include the
includes the
budget
budget stabilization factor.
Yes.
Okay,
But it goes back to the cost of living, personnel, size, at-risk, and yes.
okay,
Right.
thank you.
Actually, can you, I know you, where is it? So there it is. So the funding factor is based on cost of living. Can you do the math equation?
We decided not to include the math. It's quite, essentially, there's variables that are weighted as a function of that state formula. We can do that when we're taking this to the community, but we decided not to do that for this particular presentation. So that's feedback that you want us to include. We're certainly happy to.
A lot of folks ask how's our funding, per pupil funding calculated? So not necessarily for this presentation, but having a link, I think, is helpful for people to see exactly how it comes about. And the one on the CDE is the one that it's pages and pages. I've looked through it.
It's quite the formula.
Yes.
Okay. Additionally, as we engage the community, we want to provide some basic information about mill levy and what a mill levy actually is. So just to set the stage for that, a mill levy is the factor applied to assessed property value. And it's notable to say that that is the assessed property value, which is generally less than market value. 1 mil equals $1 per $1,000 of assessed value. As an example, in our district, a house with an assessed value of $400,000 would cost that homeowner approximately $28 per year per mil. Based on this average home assessed value, 1 mil across the district yields approximately $596,000 in investment dollars. In 1999, District 38 passed a $4 million mill levy override, and we still benefit from that today. This graphic breaks down that the local piece of the mill levy is not the total mill levy. It's breaking down the bond mill and the override, the mill levy override, so that it's a comparison of those neighboring school districts so that we can see how we compare among those districts. It's important to note that this is just general fund funding. It does not include grant dollars or categorical funding such as transportation, et cetera. These components of the tax rate are controlled by the local community and its desire to invest in our schools. Bond levy is typically used to repay bond dollars that are used to invest in capital assets, and then mill levy override invests in the day-to-day operations of a school district rather than those long-term capital needs. Neighboring districts have continued to support their school communities by passing mill levy overrides or by freezing their mill levy rate. District 38 currently has the lowest MLO of all 8 compared districts shown here.
In terms of the mill, we could easily calculate that. We have to compare ourselves to the 170 districts, or 177 others, so, okay.
I have a question. So we're comparing, just taking, for example, District 49 to Lewis Palmer for voter-approved override, and it shows us being the lowest, but then when you go back up to slide number 8, it shows them at 265.79 and us at 615.05, and Harrison at 503. I have a feeling I'm just reading it wrong.
So what you're looking at on that graph is the funding amount. It's which is based on the total mill levy. The other graphic that we're showing here is just the mill levy override and the bond. Does that make sense?
Are you asking if the D49 MLO equates to what the purple bar currently shows as
Yeah.
a function of their MLO?
Yeah. When I look at not the red, but the blue on the voter-approved override, the MLO, just the MLO, not the bond, and I look at District 49, Lewis, Palmer, Douglas County, I look at Harrison, and I'm looking at the blue graph as compared to going up to the purple piece. I understand that on slide number 8, that is our total revenue. Yes, I get that. So what is that comparison to these numbers on the side? Is that also dollars?
These are the actual mills.
Mills, okay. Thank you. Sorry. I knew I was reading it wrong.
Two different ways of.
Sure, thank you.
Okay. This next slide, we're on slide 11. Yeah. This shows District 38 as compared to those neighboring districts, the total mill levy trend over the last 10 years. As you can see, 10 years ago, District 38 had the highest total mill levy compared to these 8 neighboring districts, and now District 38 ranks the lowest. We are the thicker red line going across, if you can follow that.
What is the y-axis?
Oh, those are total mills.
Those are total mills.
Okay, thanks.
So the reason the total mill looks more in this graph compared to the last graph is what you also have in there is the state programs calculation of it's about 24 mills that we have. That's part of the state, or the local share of our Stakeholder program, which we did not show in the preceding graph because what you're looking at there is just those bond and NLO mills that were a function of voter-approved measures. So there's yes.
Does this graph express in raw dollars or number of mills?
Only mills.
So it's also related to the quantity of properties and the value of those properties in each district.
That's correct. We have a slide that's following this one that actually goes into our specific mill as a function of our assessed valuation as well. Which we did not use the comparison of other districts in this last slide. Maybe we can do that one real quick because that's the last slide.
Do you want me to go backwards? Okay. All right. So yeah, as this also shows the trend with assessed values rising in District 38, along with the decline in the district's mill levy override. The total mill levy over the past 10 years. Neighboring districts have also experienced similar increases in assessed value, but most of these neighbors, per the graph preceding, have seen an increase in mill levy support. In other words, while the typical homeowner may be paying higher taxes, District 38 is not keeping pace with other school districts in the area in terms of investment in the public school system. Let me go back.
And that really takes us to kind of a pause for this first section. So if there are questions or reflections, that's all about it.
I have a question. So when we're looking at the mills when we talked about the mills per how a mill's calculated, as we're growing in residential property, and I'm sure you'll get to the whole Gallagher piece of what residential versus commercial value means to D38 and how that's calculated versus state, how many mills per household are we at right now with that 4 million? Do you
6 points, just
a little over 6 per household?
in terms of the MLO.
Yeah, just the MLO.
The bond currently is around 11, but as we know, that continues to sunset.
Yes.
So the point of this graph, another way of saying it, is yes, as assessment valuation rises and our mill levy total mills have declined, it's just a point of reference in the conversation to say we've not experienced any additional revenue as a function of
Growth.
correct.
Growth does not bring in more revenue in the houses.
Let me go back a slide due to this one. So if you look at District 20's flat line across the top, this kind of demonstrates they were able to fix their mill levy override rate rather than their dollar amount that they were targeting. And so as their assessed values rise, their mill levy override covers that, and they're able to use those investment dollars.
They constructed their mill in a way that was able to yield additional revenue as a function of additional assessed value over time.
So their mill, make sure I understand, so their mill is set so that as the community grows, that growth brings in more revenue. The revenue to the school district keeps pace with the growth. Is that correct?
May I ask a clarifying question? I believe what they did, and please help me make sure I'm on track.
A little louder, please.
They set a fixed rate. So if your house is worth $200,000 back in 2012, and you paid, let's just say, $200, now it's worth $400,000, you pay $400. And so it's a fixed rate, is it not?
My understanding of it, and I do not claim to be the expert in District 20, is that they set a ceiling of you will not go any higher
Okay.
with this total mill. That said, what I don't understand is how much a function of their bond mills, because they do have bond mills that they every day. So
It's,
what degree
it's
does that-
included in the 60, though.
It is included
Yeah.
in the 60, that's correct. So,
So I have several questions.
yeah, go for it.
For number one, the 55.2 million from your first slide, does that include Monument Academy?
Yes,
Okay, so that's for the total district.
correct.
Okay, number two, this BS factor,
Yes.
or budget stabilization, I'm sorry, don't want to give the wrong connotation here. Is this simply a way for the state of Colorado to reduce funding for public education?
It's a way for them to balance their budget.
Or reduce on the backs of education, correct? It's a negative factor that takes away from public education. We've talked about this for 10 years plus. It hasn't changed. It's still the same thing. The state of Colorado intentionally is underfunding public education, correct?
We're not going to argue that one.
Thank you. Property tax assessments. I think what would be helpful in your presentation is to show the fact that our assessed value in our district has grown. And in fact, the property taxes that we pay as individuals has grown. But what happens is it goes to the state of Colorado, so they backfill us. That's not shown in your presentation here. I would like to see over the years that difference. In other words, there's a percentage of our total $8,000, I'll call it, that comes from local property tax.
That's correct.
And it has year over year over year. The percentage that's coming from local property tax goes up, the amount we get from the state goes down, dollar for dollar. So we have zero control in the current setup to increase revenues for our education. So we can't give a raise to teachers because we have no control over the funding in the current configuration of this formula. Is that fair? Does everybody, any questions?
More bluntly than we did, but that's essentially
I'd like to see it presented this way, though. There is no reason at all that we can't show the pie chart year over year, and then if you want to do a graph like this, it would be great too, that just shows how much of the PPOR is locally generated versus from the state. What we'll see is over the years, the state portion has gone down.
Like a bucket illustration. The
I
bucket.
guarantee you that's what you're going to see.
Yep.
Maybe one other thought pursuant to Mr. Taylor's point. Given that ultimately, when you talk about, we speak about MLOs, we speak about voters actually approving a ballot question.
yes.
What if most of our voters actually are property owners? Significant percentage. Is there a simple model we can express this in terms of dollars per average home? Because ultimately, that's the decision point.
Yes.
Is it worth an extra $25 a month, for example, for my family to fund an extra X number of dollars for local education?
We are not presenting this today. We can actually
And Ron, just to give you some thought here, my property tax has been going up every year.
Because your assessed
It's
value.
been going up every year. And the part that is allocated on my property tax bill for D38, I've gone back and looked. It goes up every year. But it doesn't change the funding for our school district. That's the key here. So I'm paying more property tax, and it's been going up for 15 years. Well, it didn't go up every year, but pretty much up over 15 years. What has gone down is the state level of funding. I'm paying more, but it's not affecting our school system. I'm trying to zero on the real point that we have a problem. The MLO from 99, I don't know what the mill amount was back in 99, but it's down to 6 or something now, and it's going to keep going down, right? Because the assessed values, the growth of our neighborhood, our assessed values, isn't helping our school system. In fact, it's almost a detriment because we get more kids and we don't get funding to accommodate them.
So,
Is that a fair, if I'm saying something wrong, please correct me.
What you all are doing is validating essentially what the overall intent of this is, which is to create not only a level of awareness, but a level of understanding to help engage the community around the conversation of now what.
so
The other thing I think might be really valuable as we begin to walk through building a scenario via presentation is to make sure that the community understands. I was here in 1999 when we approved this. There was no budget stabilization factor. And theoretically only, there was plenty of dollars once this was approved to run a flourishing school district. Fast forward 22 years and things have changed. We also need to ensure that we recognize the community did the right thing at that time, given what was happening around us or them. Now we have a different set of circumstances, and we should consider what the next right thing might look like. And this, to Mr. Taylor's point, isn't the only answer, but it's one. We always try to have several alternatives so that we're not stuck in a corner, right?
Well, I'm just addressing this presentation.
So keeping in mind with that, I don't want to miss any other questions, but we also have about 2/3 still.
Okay, I've got a couple more clarifying questions there that I haven't heard the answer to. Why is the D38 PPOR on the low end of our neighbors? Why are we so low? You can tell me about the formula.
At-risk students is the most.
We really should communicate that. Why is our PPOR low, and when was the last time it was ever adjusted? Because demographics have changed.
The factor adjusted or
The PPOR
when was the last time a PPOR was adjusted?
formula, the formula they use, which you have the formula out here. I don't know the details, but you laid it out. There's cost of living, there's all these factors, but the budget stabilization factor, I don't know that that's the reason we're on the low end.
Tweaks. I can't speak to those specifically in terms of variations of what the formula has evolved into or devolved into, as it were. So we can zoom a little closer to that.
So we have the blue, I'm on page 8, we're at 8,500, Harrison's at 9,200, Colorado Springs D11's at 8,800,
Yes.
Cheyenne Mountain and us look to be within 20 cents of each other. Manitou's at 9,100, Academy's 8,400. Do you see the differences I'm talking about?
Yes.
That's the result. That's why. Is that why?
Mostly at risk. Mostly because they have a higher percentage of at-risk students that are qualified or defined as students who are currently qualifying for free.
And that's the formula I'm looking to know. When was it really established, and what's the history of that? Does that make sense why I'm asking that? I hope it does.
Yes.
The assessment date you're using here, is it 2020 or 2019?
The assessment,
All the information that relates to the assessment Is it the 2019 assessment?
The assessed value
Yeah.
of the homes? I don't know.
It's every 2 years.
Sorry, I'm looking.
Yeah, it's last year.
2020?
Every 2 years, so
Well, I know, I'm
2020.
just trying to determine which one it is. I'm looking for when will the next one come out? It's on a 2-year cycle. Is it odd years or even years? Do you know? Just look it up. We don't need to know right now. Does that make sense? I'm kind of looking for a pattern looking forward.
So Chris, I do want, if you don't mind, I know you want to move on. One thing we do need to at least acknowledge, not that it helps, but it helps in the overall picture, is our PPR does increase by inflation. That's part of state law. Not enough, it's just by inflation. So it's cost of living that increases. So our PPR last year was less than it is this year. It doesn't, in the bigger scheme of things, obviously, so is the cost of goods, so that's why.
Except COVID, the year before, we had a big decrease, so.
Sure, that's
go
because about that, when they did the budget stabilization, the BS is when they decreased it, and they started the budget stabilization back during the recession, and there is state conversation around what can we do to fix the formula, but it doesn't go anywhere. It just is a
Hasn't yet.
discussion.
I hope it will. Are these questions okay? I just want a clarity in the
Absolutely.
presentation.
We're taking notes and keeping track of all of your questions.
Do you guys have any other questions for the first part of the presentation? Let's go on.
Okay, so I'm going to kind of go a little faster here, although Kristen's got quite a bit of good information that you're, I think, typically used to seeing in regards to an update on our new hire report. So as we're framing this conversation, we'll come back to this compensation lens in just a little bit, but as you know, about 80% of our annual funding is spent on D38 employees' compensation, which includes salaries and benefits. So we just wanted to set the stage for a closer look at who is our workforce currently right now. So with that, Kristen.
Thank you. So just to give you some context as far as the numbers of employees, we do have 751 employees. This is as of October 1st. As you can imagine, the data fluctuates quite a bit. It can look different on any given day. We do have, okay. Is that better? We do have 751 employees. You'll notice that a little over half, 52%, are licensed, with 44% as educational support and 4% administrators. And you'll notice that this does not include our substitutes or our seasonal employees. Of those 751, 351 are teachers. And you'll notice that these are split evenly between the elementary and secondary level. We do have 6 teachers on special assignment. An example of that position may be a dean. So there are 6 in the district. And then special service providers. So the 41 that we have a number of counselors. These are our social workers, school psychologists, our speech language pathologists, OT and PTs, or occupational and physical therapists, as well as nurses. In the educational support, or sometimes we refer to classified employees, there are 327 employees in this group, so it's 44% of our workforce. And we do have a wide variety of educational support employees of those listed. As you can see, the largest number of employees are paraprofessionals, and 68 of those 106 are supporting students with special needs. Two of the other large group of employees are our custodial, secretarial, clerical, and transportation. Our administrator data, we do have 32 administrators, and you can see that the central office is quite lean. We have 8 principals, 10 assistant principals. The district exec team, we have 3 individuals that are supporting learning services and 3 supporting student services, as well as taking care of safety and the leadership and learning coach, which is a grant-funded position that's currently occupied by Jenny Day.
Quick clarification.
Yes.
8 principals. Do we no longer have a principal for HSEA?
We do. We have,
We don't treat that as a school principal, that is a program coordinator.
Okay.
So we still have a principal, but because it's not full-time
Okay.
school, we don't categorize it as such.
Thanks for clarifying. I just had heard it referred to as principal prior.
So to piggyback off of that, where does the HCA principal fall under these categories?
Looking at those, I don't know that she is actually identified in this category, so she may be under a different heading. So we can certainly call that out if that's which one's called out. But
Well, I think it's helpful to know when we're looking at all these numbers, and this is great stuff. This is a lot, we get asked these questions a lot. But if there's any that are left out of this, it would be helpful to know where they are.
This is how do you want to say it? It's a little bit of a maze within the system to see exactly how our employees are classified. As I'm looking at it, I'm thinking she may be under preschool, but she is not a classified employee.
It's true, 'cause she's also our preschool coordinator as well. She wears multiple
That's
hats.
something that we can certainly revise to reflect. That's a really good eye.
And I'm also curious how many of these individuals wear multiple hats, because that's a great example of our HSEA principals, also our preschool coordinator. So,
Many of the administrators are wearing multiple hats.
so yeah, for future reference, so let's just say we have, I don't know, 13 under preschool, but maybe a preschool also falls under another category.
You would probably see at least, I couldn't even number the many slides of
Is this a,
so to speak, but
I think we're just looking at how many employees total is helpful.
okay.
This is really good.
when we look at our new hires, you'll see January 1st through August 11th. It is difficult to identify a particular period of time because we do have in the district throughout the spring for the following year. Typically with our licensed staff, they are finishing out their contract. So their last day is May 25th-ish. Our educational support, there tends to be a little bit more turnover in this area. So it is possible that we have somebody who is actually finishing out the year and not necessarily, let me clarify, when we have educational support or classified employees, there are times when we are hiring for that position, or there are times when we have a vacancy that has not been filled. So just to kind of keep that in mind. We did use August 11th because that is the first day that teachers report to work. And again, this is very fluid, so just please keep that in mind. As far as our vacancies, as of last Friday, we do have 3 licensed positions as well as a large number of educational support positions. And of course, they're all vital to making sure we reach every student every day.
That's a good question.
Absolutely.
So I noticed that we have 5 nurses, but we have 8 buildings, not including our programs at Grace Best, our HCA, and our transitions. So we're sharing 5 nurses amongst all. Is that typical?
As compared to,
Any other school district to share?
what would you say?
Everyone else, so I think it would be fairly typical.
Okay. That just seems like a heavy lift for 5 individuals with all of our district. That's what I was asking. Thanks.
I would definitely say it's been a stretch for that group as well as other groups in the current climate that we're operating in as far as COVID goes. So you could certainly make a case that those are individuals that are quite taxed by having workload right now.
Yeah, and we talked about that in the past. The weekend work, evening work, we're starting to see some of that pick up again. So that definitely is, we're in unique times, to say the least.
Okay. Appreciate that.
Okay, looking at separations during the same period, we did have 82 licensed professionals leave the district, 74 educational support staff, and 3 administrators. So our overall turnover is 21%. When you look at our separations for licensed staff, the highest areas that we've seen are folks in special education. 23% of our separations are special education teachers and special service providers. We did also see a large number of world language teachers. When you think about the district as a whole and world language, that is a significant number, and math teachers as well. We did have some late resignations this year, right before school started or that first week. When we look at the 74 individuals that left in the educational support area, you'll notice that 28 of the 74 educational support employees are paraprofessionals. And even though some of these positions are single digits, it still has a huge impact. So example, transportation. So we have a number of driver vacancies that are still need to be filled, and we're competing with many other districts as well as Amazon. So that's just an example of how, even though it's a single digit, it has a significant impact. The most common reasons for staff separations have to do with compensation. We hear that over and over again, as well as mental health, fatigue, and burnout. And a lot of those indicators are citing COVID. So I don't think we're unlike any other district. There are individuals who want to leave the field of education after the past 18 months, as well as your typical turnover with relocation, retirement, and so forth. Are there areas that, questions, reflections, areas that you'd like to see more data?
I just had a thought. Compared to the other 178 districts, where do we fall in terms of large, medium, small?
That's a good question. I would say probably.
Size, population of students.
Population of students, we are in the neighborhood of the top 30 in terms of overall size.
Okay.
So
My thought process is when, on the separations between January 1, August 11, when you were mentioning single digits, 8 transportation professionals or drivers, is there a way to relate how in this district, given our student and staff population, the impact of that. So that when people see the number 8, it's easy to think, like you said, that's a single digit and doesn't impact. But also that we are the size of district where, going back to what Tiffany and I were mentioning before, that we have multiple staff who wear multiple hats because of the size of the district we're in, correct? So is there a way to illustrate that for people so that there's a great understanding?
Almost as a proportional comparison that shows the type of impact that number may
Sure.
have on smaller sites.
That could work. I don't have the solution or the idea, but maybe some ideation around that could be helpful.
I'd like to say, though, just to answer that question, we're not a small district by any means. We're definitely not a big district. So we're kind of that just right size in some ways. That's my terminology. Because we're small enough that we can't really provide coordinated and efficient supports that rely on those multiple hats that you're referring to. And we're big enough that, you can scale some of those things as you relate that as well. So,
Sure. Yeah, and also, there are stress points where maximizing our dollars and our staff get to a point where
correct.
it gets very thin.
Katie, I have a question. On the raw number of employees in the district from October 2021, do we have,
Sorry, can you speak up, perhaps?
on the raw number of employees in the district, do we have a number from 2 years ago of October 2019? I seem to remember it was 842. Does that sound about right? It's about the time you began, wasn't
That
it?
was
Dr.
a different calculation. I think there were positions that were included in that number that would represent more minimum wage, seasonal workers, perhaps included coaches in that count. We have not lost 100 staff in 2 years, I can definitely tell you that. So it really depends on that apples to apples comparison. We can certainly represent that as trend data. The other thing that's important to mention is, I think Kristen kind of alluded to, is we're talking both in terms of total number of employees, but what's our total number of positions that we also have available. So because that number is different, we can look at that almost as what seats do we have available as part of the positions that are being filled, as well as those that are not. Because I can tell you that our vacancies were not as high as they are this year compared to 2 years ago when you are looking to that number. But I'm absolutely sure you that 842 included other categories of positions that just were not reflected in our overall count for this presentation.
I have 2 questions. Do we have the ability to compare, when we're talking about trend data, do we have the ability to compare our separation rates to our neighbors?
Yes.
And my thought process is similar to what I think Teresa's going at, is there's shortages across the board in the entire state. So if there's shortages and staff has their pick of wherever they want to go, and they're going to go wherever the compensation or the benefits or the student, whatever it is that attracts employees, if we're going to be competitive in bringing on, retaining staff, having an idea of where our neighbors are, I think is helpful.
So we do have a slide in our last session here that speaks to
Perfect.
some of that.
Okay.
But exactly to your point, there's multiple stresses across the education industry right now.
And then my second question is, I can't remember, oh, there it is. The 32 administrators at 4%, which is on slide 15, that's administrators across the district, not just Big Red, correct?
So going back to starting with 10 system principals, 8 principals, all of those are school-based leaders. The other, is that the 14 are non-school assigned, or non-school-based, if you will.
So 14 of them are non-school-based.
Doesn't mean we're not in schools.
Right.
It means that we're not assigned to a specific site location.
Sure, I'm following you. How does that compare to our neighbors?
I have another slide for you that's about to pop up, so you'll see that in just a moment.
Perfect.
Any other questions? Any other questions questions on this section? I have a couple suggestions. This HR presentation, if we could align it with the budget, I think it would be helpful. I mean, I get what you've done here, and it's very helpful, as I've heard stated, but if I knew that this category of the budget aligns, you know, that way I could see the dollar impact of all of this. So that's one suggestion, is to align this HR presentation with the budget or the forecast models. On slide 20, I was just happy to announce there's no vacancies on the Board of Education.
Clearly, you're doing something right.
Two more items. One was the trend for HR turnover, which has already been raised. The trends, so the HR turnover is 22, 23. What's it been over time? And the last thing is we have the reasons they leave. Could we put out here why they join? Why are these people joining D38?
That's a great point.
So we have some balance of information. Anything else? Let's move on then.
Okay, so keeping in mind where we are in relationship to time, I'm going to try to keep this semi-high level, but you'll see the next series of slides really speaking to different data points, again, mostly through the lens of this comparison to our 8 neighboring districts. So we'll dive right in. So first slide is showing average teacher salary for fiscal year 2021. So just important to remember, this is not updated as of this year, partly because the data is still coming in terms of this comparison. And you can see that we are currently third lowest in terms of average teacher salaries at just around 55 million, again, in comparison to the surrounding districts.
I'm sorry, but
Yep.
I would have waited, except
Go for
I
it.
hear all the time that I can go from D38 to D20 and get a $10,000 or $15,000 raise. This data doesn't say that.
So I think it really is important to mention, and what you're speaking to there, Mr. Taylor, I think is a function of, to some extent, the salary scale and potential comparison points. If I'm a teacher with 10 plus years experience and I'm at a lane that has a master's degree, and if I pinpoint where I compare to that teacher that's in that same box in D20, that may be true, the analogy that you just used.
But in the aggregate,
In the
the
aggregate,
average
it may
isn't
not be
that
true.
different.
So that's an important distinction, and I think as we zoom in on kind of
The scales.
an initial, the scales are going to be really important for us
Right,
as
I
we
got it.
go
Thank you.
deeper. Our starting teacher salary, so this envisioned the very first box of our salary schedule compared to all the other districts. First year teacher just with a bachelor's degree, so step 1, lane 1. We're a little bit higher this year. We're about 36,000, but as you can see, we are actually the lowest right now in terms of that starting pay, which definitely can impact recruitment opportunities when we are looking for new teachers.
Just, I may be missing something. What's the dotted line?
It's just a trend line or a mean line that was created as part of the graph. Is it not speaking to you?
Right-hand column, Falcon 49. So if you were doing a mean line, wouldn't you you'd have them graduated from lowest to highest?
We did not do that in the way that the data was initially ordered, so that's good feedback for us.
Might be worth,
Yeah.
just
It could-
statistically.
It could skew other slides though, because this is consistent through all the presentations, that order.
Oh,
So
that's true too. Yeah.
It's definitely a point of consideration.
Maybe you take the mean line out on
Okay.
this one.
Fair. Okay, this introduces the situation as a function of the Colorado average salary compared to the national average salary. So this is taken straight from the school finance project. So you can definitely see that Colorado lags pretty significantly behind the national average, at least as we're looking at this trend going all the way back to 92, 93, where it started pretty close, and then essentially we've just not been keeping pace for the last 10 or so years. This is another graph that depicts that.
Before you leave that,
Yeah.
I would highlight that 54,950, which is our state average, I believe,
Yes, that is.
and for Lewis Palmer, it's 51.8 or whatever the
So we-
number is. So
yes.
we're even below the state average.
That's very correct.
I would put that on this slide.
Okay,
Good idea.
great. This is just another way to represent the groupings of states in regards to which states are above and below the U.S. average. And as you can see, we're in the second group below U.S. average. This next slide is probably a little bit easier to read when it comes to this. So currently we're in the yellow range. So you'll see a variety of different studies that reflects where Colorado sits in relationship to our other, well, I guess they're including District of Columbia here, so 51 states. And I've seen rankings that have us as high, if you will, as 33rd out of 51. I've also seen studies that have us in the 42 higher category. So it just depends on which study is looking at which data points. This one was using the NCES, National Center for Education Statistics. Mr. Schwartz.
And this would get the point I think I may have recommended or asked for in our last session, which is love it or hate it, Colorado's not exemplary in investment in education, at least K through 12. Therefore, I would argue we should strongly consider benchmarking ourselves with and or against areas outside the state where there's similar dynamics because of the quality of the outcomes we want our students to end up with when they leave our district and the opportunities we want them to have in front of them because they've spent time with us here in district. And ultimately, that's why we're here.
Thank you for that point. Okay, one more slide that shows this as a function of state comparison. We cut off the outside of the state, if you will. So you're kind of looking at here the different shades representing the different districts in this region show you 4 different levels of pay comparison or ranges, starting as low as the 31 to 36 range. Again, this is average teacher salary. So obviously in a lot of our rural areas, you'll see a lot of blue or darker green. Then there's a lighter green, that's the 43 to 50 scale. We live in the 50 to 80 scale. But I think probably the next level of analysis here is where we actually sit in that comparison. So while we definitely are not as low as it could be, it's still not exactly where we want it to be.
Well, it's worth noting that the variance in all of those colors is quite different. 50 to 80 is a
There's a
$30,000
huge
difference.
range. Yes,
Yeah.
indeed.
And you might have said, but I want to make sure, that is total with all steps?
This is an average salary.
Okay, so this
comparison.
includes our veterans and our new,
Yes.
okay.
It does. Okay, so moving right along, this is now shifting into an educational support compensation comparison. So one disclaimer as we're working through these next series of slides is there is some variability as we're learning when you compare the position titles from one district to the next. So maybe not so much in this first example of instructional paraprofessionals, but we are comparing the starting salary. So this is only starting salaries, and then you can envision the rest of the scale as a function of proportionate rates of increase. So in terms of this one, we are third lowest at 1309, compared to a high point of 1470. The low point's 1281, so we did some math for you on the side just to kind of give you a sense of the average. are difference to the average, difference to high point, difference to the low point. So we're just going to move through these pretty quickly, not to diminish the importance of all of these. This is where you see the greatest difference. We are the lowest when we are coming to how we compensate our bus drivers currently. And the high point represents a $4.63 difference, which is pretty substantial. The other thing that we did not include in these is currently there are districts right now that, as part of recruitment strategy, are establishing incentives and other bonuses. We did not include that comparison through these slides. Our special education paraprofessionals, we're sitting at $14 compared to a high point of $16.79, low point of $12.49. So we're about $1 off the average there. Custodians, we were learning as we worked through this a little bit that there's some districts have a lot of different ways to refer to custodians. So you can see in some of this variability, perhaps some differences in the way that different districts title these roles, but essentially we're still sitting a little bit closer to average here, but still some differences to call out. Mr. Schwartz?
In the spirit of trying to make this absorbable by
Yeah.
our community,
Yep.
most people who don't work in K through 12 education take a number and times it by 2,000 hours a year and do a quick calculation to think about an annual salary, and that's how people consider how you live.
Uh-huh.
In terms of these types of classifications of positions, how many hours a year are we talking about? And what's the impact of difference to high point being $3 an hour?
So that does vary. I mean, the average work week is still about 40 hours for most of our employees.
But it's not a 48-hour year, a 48-week year, sorry.
Yeah, and as you're asking that question, I'm actually already on the building secretary side, so you could, this is where being able to identify how many days some of our secretaries work. Some of our secretaries are full-time or full year-round employees. Those that are school-based are typically working proportionate amount compared to what our principal's working. So there's a lot of different variation to that. So
I guess
to your absorption point, I think we could go a next level in that analysis to make it a little more.
Trying to get to what does it mean annually for these people, and then we can, you give somebody a visual, say, oh, that's $8,000 a year. That moves the needle.
That's good feedback. So again, not to shortchange our secretaries, but you do see that we are quite lower than many neighboring districts, and our difference to the average is about $1.50. Difference to a high point is about $4.43. That would be a substantial amount of money. I think we were running the math on that just quickly. It ended up being in the neighborhood of $6,000 to $8,000 annual salary difference. Okay, so you mentioned.
Before you leave those slides that you just went through.
Yes.
It's interesting that the high to low comparison varies a little bit, but what's interesting is the district that's a high. There's no consistency here in my mind. I don't see a trend of a particular district leading the way. I see in different areas, different districts have the higher wage, but we consistently are on the lower end.
Yeah, Mr. Taylor, I think what struck me...
Is there a pattern, I guess, is the
I
question.
think Cheyenne Mountain typically, I would actually put Cheyenne Mountain near the top in all of these. The one that they may not be quite there is
the bus drivers.
Sped, and they don't have the same transportation department as we do. So, but to your point, there is definitely some fluctuations. Yep. Okay, so this is the slide you were referring to, Subchurch, at least as a function of 2021. Now this data was pulled straight from CDE. So you are seeing that we are hovering around 20% with this mark. So not where we want it to be, not necessarily as high as a couple districts, but not as low as some others.
But this year's number is closer to 23%.
Yeah, and what I'd say is also important to mention, because sometimes the amount, the rate that is calculated at the CDE level based on data that is submitted may not always be a one-to-one translation back to our internal numbers. So our internal numbers are more accurate, would be my statement there, and I think CDE does some different runs with that data that we don't necessarily understand.
As you know, for the finance side, I've been a big proponent of trying to match what CDE
Yeah.
reports,
Yeah.
so we should try and do the same here.
Get as
much
close as we
possible.
can, absolutely. This is just a quick representation. We haven't talked a lot, at least to this point, in regards to the pupil-to-teacher ratio. And keep in mind that when we're referring to teacher, this is not only referring to classroom teachers, so it's referring to teachers that may not have students as part of a day-over-day class roster. But you can see that our ratio is higher in terms of the number of pupils to number of teachers compared to some of the surrounding areas. So that is important to make mention of as we're running some models and accounting for those figures as well. And then, Subchurch, I think you asked a question along these lines. What this shows is the rate of administrators to per funded pupils. So essentially, the higher the number, the fewer the administrators. So we're comparative to Cheyenne 12 and 49, and you can see other districts that just at the end of the day have more administrative staff than what we're operating with.
Yeah, this is very helpful, because we do get asked and we do get referenced that we're too top-heavy at Big Red and we're not hiring enough teachers and hiring too many administrators. And when I look at this just doesn't paint that picture. It just doesn't.
Okay, so we're nearing the end. So what I want to do, I guess, at this point is just kind of highlight a few of these additional next steps and then create a little bit more of the opportunity for some closure. So one of the things that we are committed to is creating a committee, including mostly staff at this point, but when I say committee for information gathering, I think we're envisioning this being something that's also inclusive of our community along the way. We still need to do more to dig deeper and understand how we're studying this data as a function of our employees' voices in that conversation. We will be crafting a survey system-wide to collect input. We'll also be participating in an OHM survey of other Calder Springs school districts. Do you want to speak to that, Kristen?
So this is a survey that local districts participate in, where we all indicate how much each job classification is making, and then we get the results from all districts. So that'll be a little bit of a deeper dive into the salary rates or hourly rates that you've seen for employees. So we anticipate that to be coming out soon, that survey. OHMS is a consultant group that many school districts work with. So anticipating that survey, and once we get the results, that will help us in looking at compensation. Sure. One of the things that Dr. Summers referenced, he spoke a little bit about the positions and the job descriptions and how that influences the amount that the individual is making in that position. So gathering that information and then looking at our current structure and identifying the positions that need to be adjusted. So we currently have approximately 18 different salary schedules for our educational support positions, and any one of those may have 5 different positions on a line. That's just one example. So seeing what we can do in simplifying that for transparency and sharing that information. And then what we'd like to do is create 2 or more possible scenarios for what compensation may look like. Of course, it would be pre pre-mill levy override, and then hopefully we will pass one and we can give the community and employees an idea of what that will look like, what that impact is. And then again, consolidate the current salary schedules into what that could possibly look like.
So I'll just quickly reference this summary slide, which is a lot of data that we've shared that certainly represents a downward trend for D38 in regards to PPR, community investment, and teacher staff compensation. So in the areas where we do have control over our budget, we are currently well within the range of our neighbors, including having fewer administrators per student. That's just one small data point. I would probably go to the next level to really say that what we have control over, we're doing really as much as we possibly can right now. There could be an argument that says, well, you're still not doing as much as you possibly can, and we're open to certainly that conversation as we're going forward, but at the end of the day, the discretionary dollars are just not there to be able to manipulate a whole lot with what we currently have. So last point is, despite the high quality of education our students are receiving, we are ranking currently close to last comparative to other districts in this presentation in terms of public education investment, average teacher salary, and more. And I'm not going to necessarily read through each one of these questions. There's some closing questions that we're anticipating framing for the community as we're continuing to share this and engage in more of that community-wide conversation. So these may be starting points of questions. They may not be the whole list, but certainly they represent some important considerations for us as we're going forward. So with that, I'll make sure to open the floor back up to any other final thoughts, questions, reflections that you'd like to share.
I'm wondering if on a compensation comparisons or in that unit of the presentation, if it's worth delving into a cost of living index, district by district. I don't know how complicated that would be, or if there's a way to simplify that. Just anecdotally, I know that I've spoken to teachers who live out of the district, some who live with their parents, just to reduce cost of living up here because we do live in a more affluent area.
Thank you. Anyone else?
So this is a lot of information to digest and ponder over. Are you going to, or what are the next steps in the next? I see summary, and I see additional next steps. What is the timeline on that?
So we are looking at taking a lot of what you've shared with us this morning and refining and going a little bit deeper in some places to create more of an update that we would like to share again at the upcoming regular meeting, October 18th. I'm not sure that it's going to be the full-blown presentation. I mean, we were anticipating an hour. We're sitting currently at about 80 minutes, and I don't want this to feel like just a measure of time either. I'm just mindful that there's other items, of course, that are on our agenda, and we could probably be talking about this for many hours to come. So I think just so you can visualize the community engagement piece, we would like to have a really strong, fine-tuned presentation that we can start circulating with the community in a variety of ways, both in terms of visits to schools and in-person presentations, as well as to the degree that we can create a website that has like a video-like presentation that we can share broadly and widely with the community. My goal fundamentally would be by December that pretty much everyone in our system, including all of our staff, our families, and as many community members as possible, at least has a reference to, yep, we know what we're talking about, we know how we compare, and we know how we can find more information. So for me, that's really important because I think it's hard to create an ask until we've started with saying, well, what is the current state? So again, I'd like to see that happen over the next bus conversations starting in January around now what? How are we going to address this?
So can I make a suggestion?
Of course.
I think having links for fact-checking would be good. When we went, for example, at the first of the presentation on where this, I mentioned where the information is coming from, but easy access to links to say, here's where we pulled this data from, for reference.
There's plenty of that we can do, no problem.
I think that would be helpful.
Yep.
And I personally would like to see us have conversations around, when you just mentioned ask, what is it we are and have done? For example, we tapped into our reserves, did we not? We tapped into our reserves last year to try and keep up with compensation.
Sure.
What are we doing when you talked about other districts doing incentives for recruitment and retention? What are our incentives for recruitment and retention?
We don't have any. I'm just going to be that blunt.
Okay.
We don't have the means. So,
What-
not to say that we can't envision that, but where's that money going to come from?
Sure. Well, I'm saying, I'm sure we're doing other things. For example, I've mentioned substitutes, for example. How are we treating our subs versus D20? Why are we losing subs to other school districts? And are there other things we can do that are increasing morale or non-monetary incentives we're doing? Are we just the whole bigger grand scheme of the picture? For example, us as a board, we don't have to spend $20,000 right now on an election. Can that be used for bonuses? What I'm getting at is, are we showing that we're doing everything we can? Are there places where we can trim? We know, and I say this, please understand when I say, where else can we trim? I get that we're tapped out. But how do we show the community that we're tapped out? Are we showing where we're trimming as thin as
May I reply to Tiffany? So Tiffany, the current state, what we're really trying to get here, I hope, is just a real clear picture of our current state. The things you're talking about is to maintain the current state, it sounds like to me. What I'd like to see is, what is the future state? What is it that we really want as a community, our school system to look like? And we cannot look at HR alone. We have to look at the comprehensive plan. This is a piece, and it's an important piece. But as we've all talked about, those 5 points all come together. And we have to have a comprehensive look in order to go to the community, because if we do one-offs, we've already failed at that. I worked real hard on 2 bond campaigns, and it's not going to happen. What we need is a comprehensive plan. And what I like is this is a pretty good presentation of our current state. When you go to the closing questions and say to the community, well, is this okay with you? I don't like that. I would rather say, this is what we would like to present to the community, but it isn't just this area. This is a component of the bigger picture.
Right. That's essentially what I was getting at, is having a big picture. This is great stuff.
If I can comment just real quick to that last point, Chris and Tiffany, I appreciate all the feedback. I'm just trying to be as bottom line as possible.
Sure.
We don't have, if people say there's all these possible ways forward, well, what are they? And typically what is going to happen is you're going to say, so what are you going to cut? Because if you're not going to increase revenue, you got to find expenditures that we're spending right now that certainly that's not part of this full-blown presentation yet. That was the other thing I wanted to mention, is that we can zoom in on how our spending currently compares in everything that we're applying our resources toward. But exactly to your question, Chris, and I don't want to shortchange this, we weren't sure the best way to end. And I think what you're saying is, we'll paint the picture of what we want. And that's going to take some time, and that's going to really involve more of that collaborative engagement, because I want to be really clear, I don't necessarily want our team necessarily, or even just the board, to be the ones to say, well, here's the design of all of that. That's what's going to take some real quality engagement in my mind, to say, well, there's a lot of different paths forward. Back to this last question, what are the implications if we do nothing? Well, I don't think any of those are very pretty. So what does do something look like? Well, there's a whole lot of ranges of doing something. So I think that's really what we want to rely on, those community conversations to co-develop together, going back to that timeline that we were referring to.
Excellent, excellent. And so let me ask you this. I could see the Kilmer community gathering at Kilmer and having these kind of conversations, just as I could see Palmer Lake community meeting at Palmer Lake Elementary.
Sure.
Or Palmer Ridge High School community, because I don't know how else you get everybody involved unless you go to the sites.
Agreed.
Because that's where the families and the kids are,
Indeed.
and that's where your administrators are. We're just an umbrella here.
Correct.
The feet meet the pavement in those schools.
They do.
And I'd like to see us focus this next step. I want to reiterate what I've heard already. This is a great beginning. But I also know that you have two people on your sites here that have all of 4 or 5 months here, right? So they've got a learning curve, and I appreciate that what we're talking about is, even if we had 2 years experience, is a lot of work. So I'm not trying to suggest in any way, shape, or form we need this by October 18th.
Sure.
Because I think what we're really looking for, and I want to hear that the board concurs with this, is what is the path forward? And that's where you're talking about. It's going to take some time and some effort, and I'd like to see the board participate in how does that look. And maybe it'll all come together in Big Rock number 5, which is sort of the engagement model of how does 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 then, how do we do it? Maybe we're too early to define that, because I could see where it could come out in.
I think we have some thoughts on that we'd love to put together as more formal pitch, if you will, that we can bring forward again at the October 18th session.
Good.
In addition to a lot of the great feedback that you offered up, which is very helpful as we're continuing to refine how is this going to be shared broadly and widely. Because at the end of the day, the conversation is not going to, I think to your point, it's not just here in this room that's going to make a difference, right? How do we bring this out to as many as we possibly can? And I'll go even a step toward, it's really important that we engage the folks who may not be directly engaged or involved in our schools right now as well. So
Absolutely.
that represents a huge percentage of our constituent base. So all those are really great ideas, and we just need to put them into practice and execute.
Teresa, anything?
Yeah, I just wanted to suggest connecting in the last presentation the profile of I can't remember how it was phrased, a successful graduate, or profile of a graduate from D38. And if we were to go to the community with that end in mind, I think that provides a space for more option rather than the bleak one-off conversation of we don't have enough money. Start with the profile of the graduate and how do we get there.
Sure.
In those community conversations, and I think we could get a lot of ideas and thought from the community in that. So just connecting those.
That paints a nice picture of what success looks like.
Right.
Yep. Yeah, if we don't look at the big picture and the end result, then these details will go to cost cutting.
Right.
And
Yeah, and the big picture is every individual student.
Exactly.
Correct. Big and small scale.
Tiffany, anything else?
No, sir.
Ron, anything else? Not now? Matt, anything else? All right. Thank you very much. Great discussion, great presentation. Can we take a 5-minute break? Literally, 5 minutes? That'd be okay with everyone?
I would second that.
And then we'll come back to the ESSER preliminary results of the ESSER 3 survey at 9:35. we'll go ahead and begin, Mark, but let's just give a moment for our couple board members to come back, and then as soon as they sit, let's just start. Please.
All right, so I'm going to try to keep this slightly brief. I know we went over on our last topic, but I'm Mark Belcher, Director of Communication. Excited to present to you some preliminary results from our ESSER 3 stakeholder survey. We sent this out to our entire staff, about 20 local groups in Monument and Palmer Lake area, including Monument Academy. Digging into the respondents here. It's important to tee this up that by saying we're going to use this information to inform the development of a preliminary budget for ESSER 3 funds. The survey garnered about 250 participants, and it took those participants about 6 minutes per user to complete the survey. So given that that participation, we're not too, it's not too shabby, is I guess how I would describe that. Teeing it up, sorry about that. We asked each respondent of this survey to answer what group they identified as. And I think I skipped one too far ahead. Nope. We asked them to identify between parents, students, staff, advocates, community members, and more. A few folks declined to answer this question, and we can kind of visually represent who took our survey. So looking here, the majority are parents and guardians. About 70% identified as parents and guardians. The next biggest group would be community members and then teachers thereafter. I do think it's important to call out that we had at least one respondent from each possible group fill out this survey, so we could have representation across the board. So zooming into our questions here, they're framed around our strategic plan and our 5 priorities. In all of our questions, we did ask respondents to read the question and then order. They can drag the answers around in terms of importance, with first overall spot being most important and the 5th overall spot being least important to that specific individual. For our question on priority 1, which you see here, we asked individuals to rank improving facilities to improve safety, emphasizing student and staff safety practices, safety considerations such as PPE, social emotional well-being activities, and upgrades to district facilities. There's a lot of data in these slides, so I'll move right into the next graph, which ranks the responses by share of voice, essentially. So the share of voice here, as you can see, belongs to social emotional wellness programming, although a close second would be improvements to facilities to improve safety. While you might see on the bottom scale here that 1 through 10, what I want you to realize is the larger the bar here, the higher it ranked. So more people put it as most important to them. It doesn't necessarily correlate to the ranking 1 through 5 that you talked about before. Our priority 2 question, we asked participants to rank 9 answers, including receiving additional instruction, time for students, continued emphasis on technology equipment, additional activities to support social emotional well-being, additional activities to support various populations, extended after-school tutoring programs, Saturday tutoring sessions, summer school programs, focused tutoring programs, and focused intervention programs. I did shorten some of those responses for time, but you can find the full names within the provided presentation. The clear winner in this priority 2 area was additional activities to support students' social emotional well-being, with technology emphasis and additional instructional time for students coming in at a close second and third. For priority 3, which we just went over in our deep dive, we asked individuals to rank 5 answers, including additional staff to provide support for academic learning loss, staff to provide counseling, professional development for faculty and staff focused on academic learning loss, professional development for faculty and staff focused on social emotional well-being, and then evidence-based instructional materials to aid in intervention efforts. In a runaway vote, adding additional staff to provide support for academic learning loss won. It had a commanding 59% of the market share or voice and was ranked first. It's interesting to note that as a whole, adding staff through these dollars commanded a first place share, so to speak, of 67% when you consider the second ranked option of adding staff to provide support for counseling. Further into the survey, we do lose some individuals. You'll note there that 6 individuals did skip this question, and that will grow slightly as we wrap up the survey. But that melt-off is not actually too significant, which is why I wanted to call it out. We asked individuals on priority 4 to rank 5 priorities between publishing frequent updates on district websites, providing updates during board meetings, publishing Q&As regarding the use of funding, and then continuing to seek stakeholder input and provide additional staff to steward and administer funds. Overwhelmingly, publishing frequent updates to our district website won out and was the most popular option. Interestingly, though, adding staff to support the stewardship of funds received a 73% last place vote. So I want to call out the difference between the last question where adding staff was a priority and in this one, not so much. And then rounding it out, in priority 5, which is close to my heart, we asked users to consider our communication tactics. So we asked them to consider 5 possible initiatives through communication between recruiting and retaining students, specifically those who may have fallen out of the funnel through COVID-19, advocating for and communicating free and reduced lunch opportunities, communicating online and alternative educational opportunities, advertising mental health services, sharing district activities, and then communicating our results. Also, we threw in there adding staff to help communicate the above initiatives. Similar to the last slide, we had a winner and a decisive last place rank. There was a fairly even split among the winner. Advertising mental health support did win out, with a close second being communicating our online and alternative educational opportunities. Like I said, a lot like priority 4, adding additional staff was not popular for survey participants, at least with these funds. It received a 58% last place vote. And that's a short update on our ESSER survey.
Questions, comments?
What happens next?
Casey, do you want to take that one?
So we would envision at the October 18th meeting having a preliminary list of recommended items that we can share. We have until December to finalize that budget submission. So we'd like to, in our drafting of those recommendations, allow for perhaps a second round of feedback and some additional input into that process. So we'll be sharing that information again October 18th and then again in November as we work toward a finalized budget submission.
Can I follow up with that answer? So as I understand it, these ESSER 2 funds or ESSER 3 is over a 2-year period.
That's correct.
So are we budgeting that way? How are you budgeting?
That would be our intent, is to budget with a 2-year
window
application of those funds in mind.
Any surprises or aha moments so far?
From the survey itself, I don't know that we had a chance to process it from a lens so much of surprises. We just got the data yesterday, I think.
Yeah.
So I think it's too early to really respond to that, but I think it definitely represents a cross-section of our community, and we're treating it as the information that it is, which is a nice starting point for us to have those conversations.
Is this format suitable for our big priority 1, 2, and 3? I mean, because we have 5 areas in each of those roughly. Is it possible that we could use a survey like this to gain feedback beyond, meetings?
Absolutely.
Yeah, just from a communication standpoint, I think implementing a tool like this in different conversations is certainly something we can play with. I think would be very useful.
Are these anonymous replies?
We did keep this anonymous. We don't have to. However, leaving it as an option for people to fill it out as anonymous does increase the number of people willing to take it. It also means people who aren't necessarily Google users or subscribers to a certain platform, they don't get excluded.
Could anybody from Pueblo take that survey?
Absolutely, and in fact, I'm sure we have a teacher probably from Pueblo, so they are a stakeholder and should have a voice
How do
too.
you determine that these parents, community members, teachers are stakeholders in our school district?
Sure, so we only circulated it to district stakeholders. Of course, somebody from Wyoming could have taken this survey, but we don't think that's very likely.
I guess in theory it is open enough to the public that somebody else could chime in, is what you're
Right.
saying, right?
It
Are
is.
they limited to one response, Mark?
We did not include a email, so we could not limit it to specifically one response. However, not many people are willing to go through a second 6 minutes to fill it out a second time,
Unless they have an agenda.
perhaps. So what you're speaking to is reducing the anonymous opportunity. We would be, if we wanted to limit it to one survey response per person, we would have to take an email address and then perhaps take a name and other information. So do that and ensuring we have more local data and more locked down data means we'll have probably less data.
Well, I'd like us, the board members, your thoughts around that constraint of, community, stakeholders in our community being the only ones that are available to make these surveys. Because this one, I think you've heard from the explanation, it could be somebody from New York, right? But it's probably not, I get that. But do we want to have any kind of constraint to ensure that it's stakeholders of D38 only to participate, much like we do with public comments, right? With public comments, if you don't live in the district, you're not a stakeholder, we're not going to let you make a public comment per our policy. So this is feedback to the board, and I'm just wanting to see what your thoughts are.
Couple thoughts there, Mr. Taylor. First of all, how would you verify, for having a physical address? And then even then, I was involved in another organization where we tried to do something very similar. There's steps, but when everything's said and done, there's no way to guarantee that the participants are actually stakeholders. So we could put additional steps in place, but my only question would be, would those be impediments for stakeholders to actually participate?
Right. And to that point, then, if we can't really constrain it that way successfully, is there a way that we, weigh the results accordingly? Because I don't, data's data, but some data I lean on a little heavier than I do other, and I just don't know the value here, is where I'm getting at. Ron, any thoughts?
I think it's a double-edged sword. Right, you go one way and people may not want to be identified. You go the other way and people are proud to be authenticated and have that identification of the community. Maybe we look at this from a different standpoint, which is how do we get the maximum participation from the constituency we're looking for? And I'd lean on the communications executives for that because I'm not smart enough in that area.
Thanks, Ron. Tiffany, any thoughts?
So I think that the anonymity is part of the reason folks feel comfortable, so I would not want to get rid of that. I think that's important. I like the idea of one and done. You can answer once if there's a way to put that into effect. But it is a double-edged sword, I agree, in that somebody that's not a direct stakeholder to District 38 answers it, but we still have anonymity. I think it's important because my question was going to be, there's a section at the end of it where people could give input and additional thoughts, and I was curious to see what additional thoughts came out of it.
Sure. We'll need just a little bit more time to collate that data.
Okay. But that's an example of somebody may not speak freely if they don't, if they're afraid they might be identified.
Teresa, any thoughts?
No specific thoughts other than, I don't know if there's a way to do it anonymously and limit it to one survey per IP address or something, using technology to control that.
Sure. We'll look into that.
Excellent. So, thank you everyone for weighing in. I think you have a platform. It's called Thought Exchange, and the Thought Exchange a year and a half ago when we were doing those listening tours, you used that, I thought, quite effectively. The question becomes: is it possible that if we're at Kilmer, we do a Thought Exchange? Can we also then distribute this to the known stakeholders in the Kilmer area? Kind of do a combination where it's Thought Exchange in person and a survey around the same time for the broader stakeholders. Just a thought.
Potentially.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
I actually have one question, and maybe this is a next step. When we're looking at this data and we're putting this together, this is part of the process of how this particular ESSER 3 grant funds are received. I know we went over it at our last board meeting, but just to reiterate again, these monies are not tied, our hands aren't tied to mandates by receiving these grants, correct? If I understand that right. The mandate is we had to collect information, and the mandate is it can only be spent certain areas.
I think I know where your question is going. I'll answer it two ways. One is there are certain allowable uses that we have to be aligned to as we're distributing these funds. In terms of mandates that could be represented as COVID mandates by an outside entity, no. We are not being held to that standard as we are using these funds.
Can these funds be used for, say, a employee bonus, for example, for a retention bonus?
We're still researching that. The short answer is there may be some strings that we have to really line up in order to allocate these one-time funds toward potential compensation-related dynamics. So I can't answer that as simply as yes or no right now. It depends.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Our next work session item is number 3, policy update. So I have the matrix open that was on the board docs, and there's quite a number of policies here, and we have different admin and then board leads associated with them. All of them except the first 3 are single priorities, if you will. The first 2 has 1 and 2, 1 and 2, and then the third one here is 1, 2, 3, and 5. And I'm not sure why this is on the agenda, but let's open that up for conversation. Teresa, I think you let me know early this morning that you wanted to talk about the third one, I believe, IMB.
Yeah, and the reason that came up was just because, in part, because of the short notice change in our last meeting and that you weren't here. And it came up in that meeting that the language of IMB, I believe it's IMB or IMBD, was initially introduced from you and then taken to the attorney and then came back as, so I felt like the discussion hadn't been whole yet without you here. So wanted a chance to really look at this because whereas the other policies that are listed in these revisions are, to me, simple changes, this one actually has a lot of language. It's additional added language, and I just wanted to know, to hear other board members' thought process on the IMB especially.
Let me recast my recollection here then. I think in June, I initially made a proposed language suggestion that I shared with the board and with Casey. Then in August, I came back with my own revision to it, which was in both cases a one paragraph. And then what's actually shown up, I think Amber and Casey actually fleshed it out in more detail. So I can speak to why they fleshed it out further. But let me try and go with this. What is there part of the language that's troubling, or I'm trying to understand why? What's the issue? I'm
Sure,
not trying to
yeah, I
understand
think the
that yet.
issue for me personally is why are we adding this?
Why are we adding the
Yeah,
language?
why would we consider I guess we haven't added it. Why would we consider adding this language underneath IMB, which is teaching about controversial issues and use of controversial material?
Because I think the language itself speaks for itself, I think, but maybe I'm misunderstanding your
Sure,
question.
to me, it seems, if I recall correctly, in June, we were talking about the anti-discrimination statement. And then when that went to the attorney, correct me if I'm wrong, came back and attorney guidance was that it fit better under this topic. I actually see it as quite disjunct, which made me reflect back on the anti-discrimination statement to ask, why are we, I don't see anything here that isn't covered in the anti-discrimination statement or within the context of teaching controversial subjects.
Ron, got a comment?
Can we just read the language so that we're all, no pun intended, on the same page? Thank you.
It's probably not associated to this meeting.
Would you like me to read it?
Yeah, that'd be great.
I have it up.
I don't know where.
I'll speak loudly. Okay. So this is at the end of policy IMB. So currently the language reads, finally, it is the intent of the board that administrators, faculty members, other employees, and students at public schools respect the dignity of others, acknowledge the right of others to express differing opinions, and foster and defend intellectual honesty, freedom of inquiry and instruction, and freedom of speech and association. To this end, District 38 will not direct or otherwise compel students to personally affirm, adopt, or adhere to any of the following tenets. Number one, that any sex, race, ethnicity, religion, color, disability, sexual orientation, or national origin is inherently superior or inferior. Number two, that individuals should be adversely treated on the basis of their sex, race, ethnicity, religion, color, disability, sexual orientation, or national origin. Or number three, that individuals by virtue of sex, race, ethnicity, religion, color, disability, or national origin are inherently responsible for actions committed in the past by other members of the same sex, race, ethnicity, religion, color, disability, sexual orientation, or national origin. Mouthful, that's it.
Okay, so do you want to run? I mean, you have to have that read. Does that help?
Very much so, thank you.
So, I mean, Teresa's, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but she's, I think, saying, why is it in here? Why are we doing that? Right? Is that my
Yeah.
understanding?
Yeah, that's the
So
question.
you would just like to, what, strike that and not add it? Is that your, I'm really trying to understand where you're coming from.
Sure. Well, yeah, I don't see a purpose for it. Personally, as one board member, I think the more policy verbiage that is added, the more complicated policy becomes. So I'm a simple policy person. I don't see that this, in the end all, I think that how does our policy serve every student? That's one of my guiding principles. I don't see a change here that adds to the education of our students or allows additional value or guidance for our teachers and staff.
Well, the language that I proposed in June and modified in August, and then that's been fleshed out in more detail, seems to me to actually direct more equity, inclusion, and fairness. So I'm not sure what the how are we not addressing every child? This to me does exactly what you want to accomplish, if I'm understanding correctly.
May I maybe ask a corollary question? Is there something here that might be limiting for a student or an instructor that would create an adverse effect versus what the intent is?
Yeah, so Amber, would you mind coming up to the mic? Because you and Dr. Summers should address this. I will add to that comment that I've had some teachers come to me and say, why do you need to put the language in there? Because that's the way I already do it. And I'm like, good, then the language isn't a problem. They said, yeah, that's right. So that's the only feedback I've had on this, other than this discussion that Teresa's raising. So Ron, please repeat the question, because it sounded like one that either Casey or Amber can address.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, in the spirit of attempting to clarify, is there anything in this language that might create an adverse effect or be limiting or constraining to any of our students or instructors in terms of us achieving our goals in how they teach, what they're able to teach to make themselves effective?
I'm not sure that we've asked teachers about that question, so that would be, my response would be, I think we would have to ask our staff for some input to know what they might think about that.
That's my hesitation as well in a direct response to that question. It's hard to know without having that conversation with students and with staff. That's just the reality of.
And I haven't been on the board since we've added this much to a policy or revised a policy to this extent. So I'm not sure, and I don't know, Mr. Clausen, if you have been, because you're one of the longer standing people on the board, or the longest standing. Has there been a time when policy has been introduced where we have gotten some feedback from the superintendent's staff or the teachers in some form that could be helpful in terms of informing us as to whether this is not just helpful, but guiding and essential for our policy?
That's a good question, Ms. Phillips. A couple thoughts there. My mind reflects back to when this board passed a resolution regarding sex education. I think to some limited degree we did have input of teachers and so forth, but ultimately we, as the board members, provided direction for Dr. Summers to implement policies and procedures. And I have no problem consulting with teachers, and that's where the rubber hits the ground, but ultimately it's this body that directs or charts the direction of course for our district. And as Mr. Taylor artfully articulated, this has kind of been a discussion that's been ongoing, and it sounds like the language was changed a little bit, but from my perspective, the language encompasses all our students, wherever they might be, and it provides our teachers with more direction as far as how they should be instructing their students. So as one board member, I support this language.
May I also suggest that we could break this particular MDB out as a separate item rather than, part of a consent approval? Because if you have heartburn in any way, shape, or form, and I don't mean that, with a pun, but, if you don't want to support it, I think you should be able to register your vote not to support it. So is it okay with you if we pull it out separately as a vote, because we're coming up on a second reading? I haven't heard any suggested language changes. I'm wanting to be real clear. You're not suggesting any language changes. You just want to strike the changes altogether.
Sure, or, I just wanted to inquire as to the why, because I think that's important. And then also, I think it's perfectly appropriate to pull it out separately. And I have a number of thoughts going through my thought, because I feel like whereas all the other policies that are listed were just being reviewed by staff and team as part of our process this year, this one is different because it is a proactive, or I might also add, not to be divisive or anything, I also think it's a reactive addition to the policy in some ways, and that's a concern for me. So,
Be specific, I'm sorry.
point number 3, that individuals are inherently responsible for actions committed in the past. We received a number of emails in the spring and early summer regarding critical race theory that Dr. Summers responded to, and that I saw that you responded to a number as well. It's a really important discussion and dialogue. I don't have any problem with the dialogue. I think that this may take really, really thoughtful consideration in terms of implementing into policy, because that is a lasting effect. And are we being reactive in a moment that will, and then implementing policy that will affect our students for a long, long time, and or our teachers and staff? I want to be really, really thoughtful and do our due diligence in terms of the dialogue that goes into this. This is a touchy subject. This is very difficult. This is not easy for me to bring out in our community either in terms of a public conversation. But I am trusting you as my fellow board members to take the seriousness and the real thought of this as to how this affects our teachers and our students in their ability to have critical thinking conversations in the classroom day to day. That's my concern, is that this would be limiting, and I don't have the feedback from teachers or staff or people who are in with our students, or even the student voice for that matter. I don't know that I have a comprehensive enough picture of what is needed, if anything, in order to vote in support of this.
Understood. So I'm going to step back from these policies and talk about our strategic plan that's been undergoing now for a couple of years. And I'm trying to push real hard for a long-range, comprehensive strategic plan, which means all of these policies are going to be addressed because, in fact, the principles, the guiding principles for our school district are the Board of Education policies. So even though we may not have spent a lot of time on policies in the past, we will in the future. And I'm glad you're raising this. I have no problem with that at all. This is the kind of conversation we should have. This isn't sensitive to me at all. But when you bring up a partisan issue like critical race theory in a nonpartisan role on the Board of Education, I'm a little concerned, frankly. Let me finish, please. Please let me finish.
Sure.
I'll give you plenty of time. Critical race theory, I've read the genesis of it. Generally speaking, it's used in graduate level programs in colleges, not in K to 12. So I'm going to beg to differ with you about critical race theory being an issue at all relative to this. And you're suggesting that it's reactive to a partisan matter is as far away from the intent of my heart as possibly could be.
Sure. No offense, and with all respect.
I'm not taking offense.
Okay. So I brought up critical race theory because we received emails about it. I'm not bringing it up because I'm bringing it to the table. But I know that there were people requesting via email that we pass a resolution against critical race theory. That was in the late spring and early summer. I know that the language in this third bulletin is problematic for me personally. I know that there have been community conversations and national conversations around white privilege. I'm not I am not at all, have no intention of bringing politics into our board discussion. But we are in the realm of public education, and these conversations come up, and that's been part of my intention all along, is that I'd rather have the dialogue and the discussion and the definitions and clarity around these issues rather than not have it, rather than talk around it and avoid the terminology. So I meant nothing else past that. So if I misspoke, I apologize. As I said, it is a tough thing.
May I make a comment?
I will just add, it is tough because I care. I care about our students. And I don't want a single policy to affect a student in a negative way. And I think that we actually agree. I think that your intent is, I think we're all on the Board of Education because we have the intent to do well for our students. The question is, how best do we do that? And in this case, I am not sure.
Okay, Ron, I just want to clarify a little bit, Teresa, because I enjoy the conversation a lot. So what I heard you just say is the third bullet is the one you have trouble with?
Absolutely, yes.
And can you read that third bullet once again? Because I want to make sure I'm understanding clearly what the issue is.
That individuals by virtue of sex, race, ethnicity, religion, color, disability, or national origin are inherently responsible for actions committed in the past by other members of the same sex, race, ethnicity, religion, color, disability, sexual orientation, or national origin.
So I'm trying to understand how, and I'm going to use my own language, but basically, regardless of my characteristic, my forebears, whether they're from Ireland, Denmark, Iran, Afghanistan, India, wherever they're from, I'm not responsible for something they did in their lifetime. Is that, am I getting that generally right? Is that what it's saying?
Essentially, we are, the preface to all that is that D38, as administrators, teachers, curriculum, what have you, will not direct or otherwise compel students to personally affirm, adopt, or adhere to any of the following tenets. So that third tenet.
So if we take it out, then a teacher could help children affirm that if my ancestors are from India, I'm responsible for something they did, or Ireland, or it, you know, that's just national origin. But the rest of those characteristics are equally comparable here. What if I'm a child being raised by LGBTQ people? Then am I going to suffer? Because this would open that door to saying somehow that what they're doing is inferior or superior to something else. What the whole purpose of this language is to avoid that. So that's my reply to your concern about this issue. I'm more than happy to take it out as a single line item. Board members, do you guys have any problem with breaking this one item out as a separate agenda item on the upcoming regular boarding for voting purposes?
Can you clarify when you say break it out? Break out
The IMB, the entire thing.
just this and vote on. So you're asking, let me make sure I understand, that all of our policies will go in consent for us to vote, and then this one will be one where we vote on individually?
No, we're going to have a second reading, and then we'll
Right.
do the vote. But this one, we're going to vote separately. This one
Maybe
policy.
vet it deeper.
Wait,
I haven't said that yet. I was going to ask Teresa, do you want to just strike that third paragraph, or do you want to rewrite it somehow? because I still don't know what the troubling nature of the words are.
Can I share my perspective as well?
Please.
Here's where I actually do not have a problem with this, and here are the reasons why. We set out at the beginning, back in the summer, and said that we were going to look at all of our policies comprehensively. So I actually hope that when we're looking at our policies going forward, that's the board work we're doing moving forward this year, is actually scrutinizing our policies on how can we improve them, how can we strengthen them, how can we get better. The reason I don't have a problem with line number 3 is because this policy, it even says in here specifically that teachers are not allowed to indoctrinate our students. And therefore, I don't want any student to come home from school and feel inferior, whether they're LGBTQ+, whether they have ancestors that behaved incorrectly. It doesn't matter. No child should leave our buildings feeling inferior or superior. And this says right here, to this end, that that we will not compel students to personally affirm, adopt, or adhere. So for a student to affirm, adopt, or to adhere to any tenant, that to me does not belong in our school buildings. That's part of raising our children to have values as a parent. So I would hope that we would affirm that our educators are teaching our kids how to think, not what to think. And so these 3 tenets actually support that value that we discuss all the time of having our students leave knowing how to articulate what it is they believe and why. And it's okay to have controversial discussions. That's what this policy is saying, is we can have discussions. But during those discussions, no child should feel compelled to adhere to something. That's a family value, and that's my personal perspective.
Thank you. And so to add to that, Teresa, to walk in the talk here, if you will, I want your suggestion, and I think Matt's question is really good. Do we have 2 forms, one that as is and one with just deleting number 3 altogether, or do you want a chance to try and rewrite it? I'm not sure, but I want to pursue it.
I hadn't thought about proposing optional language. I didn't. I could put my mind and hand to that, but I think Matt's option of having 2 different forms where I don't see points 1 and 2 as problematic, other than I'm still not convinced this lies in teaching about controversial issues, because those aren't controversial issues that are in purple. I think to me it's more of related to the anti-discrimination statements, which might just lead us back to loop 1, which was
where we started.
So.
No, I hear you, and I actually, that's why I went there at the beginning, was it seemed like it was an anti-discrimination policy we should address. So Casey, I think we came back here because this is, conceptually, this is my understanding, is that we wanted to reinforce the non-discrimination in the teaching of sensitive material. Mm-hmm. Not that the policy itself is sensitive material, but that we want to ensure that we're not teaching sensitive material in a way that indoctrinates, if you will, to some inferior or superior result on behalf of every child. Casey, I don't, the board attorney said that he didn't see the reason to put that under discrimination, so we kind of migrated here.
But I don't see, there's CRT, to me, that's a political hot potato. So that, to me, should not play into this at all. To me, that's noise. We don't have
what
CRT
did you start
in
with?
school
I
district.
didn't hear.
I said CRT when we talk
CRT,
about that.
right.
That's a political hot potato. So to me, that doesn't factor into this because that's noise. This is something that seems fundamentally, it strengthens, to me, it just strengthens the position of where we are. I guess I agree with you, Chris, that that part bothers me, that that's the hang-up, because to me, that's not the hang-up. If we're not teaching CRT in our school district, then that shouldn't be a factor in this, because we're not teaching CRT in our school district. We already said we're not, so.
Let me clarify then, because I might have led us down a thought tangent that doesn't apply. I see policy, when it's written well, as governing in an umbrella fashion that allows the best creative, critical, educational responses from our teachers in the classroom under Dr. Summers' guidance. So to point 3, I see that as more of a training, if you will. That might not be quite the right word, but to be overseen by policy. And to be truthful, I'm an educator, Chris. I don't know any other teachers that would impart that to one individual student, that they are inherently responsible for actions committed in the past by members of a group. So to me, that's a learning and training component to the professionalism of our teachers and our administrative staff. Directed by policy to that degree is concerning to me.
One thing about this policy is we just talked about the influx and dynamics and professionals coming and going from this district. One thing about policy is it outlines the framework for expectations of criteria for our teachers. And so, at this point, maybe we don't have those types of issues, but if we have teachers coming from different parts of the country, and they have their philosophy of ways that things should be taught in the classroom, to me, this policy just provides some common guidance, so everything that is being addressed in the classroom, or perhaps not being addressed, is consistent.
Ron, do you have anything you want to add to this? Because I think so, Teresa, what I'm willing to do here is to break it out as a separate vote item, right? That one policy. And I personally would want to vote on it as it's been presented. Do you want it to be presented some other way? Because it's either going to get voted in or out, right? And so if it gets voted out, we have to revise it.
I don't know. I don't have I guess.
I apologize, but I literally do not have the problem with the language that you're
Right.
feeling. And,
No
I'm
apology
trying to, in
necessary.
my mind, understand how it could be detrimental, and I can't get there.
I'd appreciate it being pulled out from the other policies then.
Okay. So when we have our regular agenda, we'll have 2 sections for second reading, 1 section for everything except IMB, and then 1 for IMB separately. Everyone okay with that approach? Awesome. Whoops, I went to the wrong meeting. I gotta
Thank
go
you,
backwards.
Amber.
Thank you.
Actually, can I make one comment while we're transitioning?
Please.
Isn't this the critical thinking we intend to espouse through our school system, and the capacity to have this kind of conversation without making it personal?
Well, in fact, I applaud Casey for what they did last year with his training of all staff about critical thinking. But it's not happening in the classrooms, and it isn't going to. And this is graduate level thought process. It isn't going to be entered into K through 12. So that CRT is not the issue here.
Correct.
We got that conflated here, and this shouldn't be. Can I move to the next agenda item and talk about the public comments and emails received by school board members? I want to start that part with the public comment part. Prior to the COVID pandemic, which the governor said is over last March or whenever he ended, June, whenever he ended the mandate, we allowed, because we're remote 100% on our meetings, but now that we're in person again, I don't think we've ever allowed emails to be written or read into public comments. And I don't want to establish that as a practice going forward because it was a short-term way to get public comments during remote meetings. Does everyone agree with that? I mean, I don't believe.
Well, I think the concern, I think one of the concerns is pandemic is not over necessarily, and there are people who are concerned about being in public gathering spaces to give a public comment. So do we provide an option for that right now? I'm just...
That's the question.
Yeah.
So one thing, if I may, Mr. Taylor, would just direct your attention to, if you haven't read it recently, it's not part of our current review of policy, is policy BEDH, public participation at school board meetings. So in reviewing, again, this specific policy, at this point in time, there is no reference to how do we manage any electronic communication that is coming in. It's only, and it's working obviously under an assumption the last day it was revised was May 17th of 18, that it really is how we conduct the coordination or the implementation of those public comments as a function of attendance at a regular meeting or special meeting. The specific request, I think, and Vicki helped me with this, is when we were in virtual settings or moving from a combination of virtual to in-person, essentially about the middle of last year, maybe earlier in the year, there was a addition to our agendas that said, should you wish to address the board as part of public comment through electronic communication, you need to submit this electronic communication by a certain date or a time, and that we will read that into the record, which is what we did for a few of those meetings when we received those. When we moved back into our full in-person meeting modes, that communication was then, the reference to that was essentially removed. So with that in mind, I think, I'm not sure to what extent our community is aware that has been removed. I think this most recent meeting, there was an individual member of the public who really did want or desired the email to be read into public and asked as much. So we just did not address that within the context of the last meeting, hence why we're processing through it right now.
What was the time frame that we suggested during the remote meeting process? How soon did they have to get those in order to be?
By the Monday of the meeting.
The Monday of the meeting.
Since we've been back to live meetings, how many, other than this most recent one, how many emails have we read?
I think the last one was last school year.
It's been a while.
May or June.
This one popped up last minute almost. I don't know what time it came in, honestly.
This was an unusual circumstance in that it was a last-minute submission to Mr. Taylor and myself. Please read this comment in the evening. Circumstances happened that day. Mr. Taylor did not have access to read that email in a timely manner.
Did we read it on that night or no?
We did not, because I was not aware of it.
Right.
I just responded to that individual and said I could not guarantee her email would be read into the record of the meeting, but we would wait for Mr. Taylor's response.
Well, what does the board feel about this? Because I think, you know, Teresa, I think, is suggesting that we should have an avenue still to read emails for a period of time. I don't know how long that might be.
Seemed appropriate to me, just given that the Delta variant came up, and if something else would come up, I guess we could reassess at a regular interval. But I'm not sure, whatever.
Do you want to go this way or this
No,
way?
Ron was about to jump on that.
I was just actually going to suggest a compromise, and this is a great example of diving deeper into how can we improve our policies. So BEDH is a prime example. We could revise that. Some school districts that I've watched and seen when there's an email, a parent or a stakeholder can send in their email. It doesn't get read out in board comments, but that email can be requested to be submitted into public documents. So there's some emails that we get from constituents and stakeholders, especially, for example, students, where we wouldn't want that to be public because we want to be able to protect that privacy. But if a stakeholder requests for it to be entered into public records, it doesn't have to be read, but it could be still part of public records, and maybe that's something going forward. Maybe that is, when we look at the silver linings of the pandemic, maybe that's a silver lining on improving communication.
Rob?
I just think any chance we have to communicate with our constituents is a positive.
Okay. No?
You know, I really appreciate Ms. Phillips' position in when the pandemic was causing a lot more issues. It made a lot of sense to me. Just from the lens of my professional life, I'm always concerned about opening up emails that be sent in from individuals that we really have no way to verify if they're live within the boundaries of District 38. But I also concur with Mr. Schwartz that I always like to hear from my constituents. So I think it's just finding a fine line. If things do become more problematic and things are shut down, maybe we kind of revisit it. But other than that one email, which I think is kind of isolated, it seems like things are going relatively well.
Yeah, but I think if you guys are okay with it, why don't we direct Casey and Mark to update BEDH, I think it is? It is. To enable email communications to be read, meeting the criteria for public comments, right? That they have to be a stakeholder and they have to, right? And we need to have a time frame, because if we get them a few hours before our board meeting, we don't even have a chance to read it. And I guess I'm a little concerned because that's when we don't know what's in that email, right?
And then the other dynamic, Mr. Taylor, if we're only allotting a specified period of time and we get lose with emails, then people actually show up, don't have that opportunity. And so instead of 10 comments, we're looking at 25. How do we truncate the emails
Right.
that we receive? So there needs to be some.
Well, would it be okay if we just prioritized in-person first and then emails with remaining time up to whatever we can get in?
And any of the remaining, well, all of the emails would be still put in the public record, correct?
If I may, what Mrs. Upchurch was referring to actually reflects a lot of my prior experiences as well. And I think what you added to it that made me feel almost more confident was that that individual is actually requesting it to be part of the public record, in which case we can easily attach it to the public comment portion of the agenda. And if there's time to read it, perhaps we have the ability to say, here's what's being read into record. If not, well, we can reference it, it's still there, so anybody could go in to see that as part of that public comment. Because if I'm not mistaken, I think in September we actually had 10 in-person public comments. We had 30 full minutes already slated, and even with that email coming in requesting to be read, we wouldn't have necessarily had the additional time this year, saying Mr. Clausen. So I think it gives us enough direction to draft what essentially would amount to a first reading. We can also revise our matrix to update that.
And I'm not suggesting a sunset either. I actually, let's change the policy and it should be good moving forward. I don't know that an official end of the pandemic should change it necessarily. I like the idea that somebody raised this might be a silver lining from that, right? It just improves things. Is everyone okay with this direction?
And just to be clear, and tell me if this is consistent with what you experience in other districts, but if a email is going on the record, we need their name, we need a valid phone number, and we need their address.
Essentially, yes. So what we'll have to do, and I'll ask Ms. Wood's help in this, is be very transparent with the community to help them understand, should you wish this to be read into or included as part of the record, here's the criteria that we need, to your point, Mr. Clausen.
What's nice about that also, and valid, is it puts the people on email on equal footing with those that invest the time, the energy to show up. Doesn't mean because you come in an email, you're not willing to do that. But those that come are identifying themselves, they're authenticating themselves as members of the community. So it puts the emailers on equal footing.
Well, and to take it one step further, if we have someone that speaks at a board meeting, do they give them the opportunity to lodge their written comment as well? That's a question, because if you have someone that does not follow the board meetings and is just looking at everyone that's submitted emails, you want to also give individuals that actually appear here to also provide that email that would be part of the record, so to speak.
And it's happened to us actually in the past where the speaker will hand us out their 3 or 4 pages and say, now they're going to make their comments, and they summarize it because they only have 3 minutes. I have no problem with what you're saying. I don't see putting limitations on it is helpful. We have a 30-minute window. We'll prioritize it. We'll read what we can. If we can't, we'll notice that it's in public record.
Can I add one more suggestion to that?
Please.
That there's also protocol on, oh, never mind. Actually, that doesn't, I was
Well,
going to say, if we read it, if we go the direction of reading it out loud, because sometimes there is confusion of, sometimes you've read it, sometimes I read it, and if it's directed, say it's something directed at me, for example, well, who would read it? Should it be Vicki or President, or if it's directed at the President? You see where I'm going with it, so that there's a protocol of consistency.
so Mark and Casey, you got some work to do. Is there a chance we could get a first reading by the 18th for this one policy?
Yes, we will update the matrix accordingly, and we will have a draft of a first reading.
And get it out to us as early as possible so we get a chance to read it before the first reading. Is that fair, everyone? Good point. Anything else? Because that was sort of the email aspect of this. There was board comment, or public comments were already good on them. So that's how it tied together. We're good? Yep. All right. Dr. Summers.
Okay, our last item, in terms of at least an update, will be included in your agenda, and Mark is pulling this up. So we, as you know, have not been operating a live or updated COVID dashboard as we did last year. We received varying feedback about that. At the end of the day, we are wanting to share, and with your permission and approval, this would be what I would like to do from this point forward, which is at our regularly scheduled meeting dates for the year, at least as long as we need to do this. We can present our current number of confirmed cases, which you see in the left-hand column, and then the right-hand column is the total number of cases from, if I'm not mistaken, Mr. Frampton, is the beginning of the year, he had to leave. I believe it's the beginning of the school year, so this is...
Can we add that to the chart so there's no question?
That would be a good piece of information to include as well. So, essentially, those are the numbers. Don't really have a whole lot more to comment on unless there's any questions that we can respond to.
Where would this live?
We will have this on our website as well, on our this COVID section of our website.
What? Okay. I meant at our board meetings, would it go into consent, or would it go into...
No, it'll be included as part of an update, but
Okay.
it's not really anything that you have to vote on or
Sure.
anything like that.
Makes sense.
So essentially, this is the D38 dashboard you're proposing.
If I can take this from the language away from a dashboard and just, these are numbers. These are at least the confirmed case numbers. Now, the thing that is also different this year than last is we were reporting numbers of quarantines. Without going into a ton of detail, it's extremely cumbersome to track all of that information and report it alongside the cases.
And I'm not really asking for more. Where I'm going with this is, and this is more about these individuals and their families, all communications that are necessary are happening, correct?
That is absolutely correct. And the other thing that just jumped into my mind mind, as you said, that is, we are obviously not distinguishing between students and staff in these total numbers. So that would be another component to protecting the confidentiality of those that are involved.
So the balancing act that I'm hearing here is there's the HIPAA laws about health and disclosing anybody's health issues compared to the social community need to know if they've been exposed, right?
So that the way we are communicating those potential exposures is through a very localized process that does involve, to whatever degree is necessary, the contact tracing. That is part of our identification of individuals who may need to isolate, which refers to those individuals that are sick or COVID positive, compared to a quarantine, which we know is individuals who may have been exposed. So all that said, yes, I do want to just add the comment, we are not necessarily, know that often HIPAA gets referred to in a school district setting, but we are not medical providers. Therefore, we are not necessarily falling under an umbrella of not sharing medical information. We don't have a lot of medical information on our individual staff or students.
Well, isn't that one reason that you choose not to do testing?
That's a piece of that equation, I would say, absolutely. However, we are obviously bound by FERPA, Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. So under that heading, absolutely, we are making sure to maintain the confidentiality of the individuals involved.
So a year and a half ago, we passed a resolution to give you the control of COVID reactions, I'll call it, or actions and reactions. And this is the current update that you want to be able to use for this school year, essentially, is here's the number of cases where they're at. All the other communications are being handled directly with impacted people.
That's essentially correct, yes.
Any questions?
I like transparency.
Anything else to update us with?
Not at this point. Thank you.
Matt, do you mind if we start with you and work toward me?
Ms. Taylor, I don't have anything. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Matt. Ron?
Yes, a couple things, very briefly. I think everybody on the board is thankful that Mr. Taylor back with us today in 100% health, so welcome home.
Thank you.
We're really excited that our colleague and friend and peer is back with us. And we live in a place where this incredible state-of-the-art healthcare has significant impact on many, and in Chris's case, it did. I only bring this up because all this innovation begins right here with us in our school systems, public, private, and charter. And everybody at these tables and all community members here are here at their own volition with no compensation to make sure the next generation gets it at least as good as we had it. And I would argue let's continue to move forward together. We all want almost all the exact same things. And we will be judged not on what we say, but what we achieve and what we do. And if we plow forward, have a nice view of what success looks like, we're going to get there. Thank you.
Thanks, Ron. Tiffany?
I just want to say that I want to thank you for bringing up hard topics to talk about, because I think the beauty of each of us as unique individuals is the passion. I appreciate the passion we have for our kids and for our kids' education and for our teachers. And we all have that common ground of finding those commonalities. And sometimes we may not agree on how to get there or what that looks like, or not be able to understand or relate. But I am so grateful that we can have open, honest, and respectful dialogue. And so I appreciate that. Thank you for bringing that up. That's all I want to say, is I appreciate the dialogue that we have, and I think that that's how we continue moving forward.
Thank you, Tiffany. Teresa?
Thank you, Tiffany. I appreciate that. I've used up enough airspace. I have no comments.
Well, good. I appreciate being here, and I appreciate the love that I felt, the gifts that were sent, the words of comfort, both from the board and from the admin folks. I appreciate more than you know the comments that I read, the beauty of the flowers, and the love that we felt in our home from this community, from our family and our friends. Everything else takes a second place when you talk about interpersonal relationships. So, isn't it a wonderful thing that we get to serve in this capacity on this board where in our each individual school community there's connections that are going to be lifelong. And I love that because that's part of the whole child, is those relationships that they establish from K through 12 that carry forward with them over time. Just so happens this year we had a 50th anniversary of my high school reunion, which was delayed by a year, so it was really 51 years ago. I didn't make it because of what happened to me, but I got to see a lot of pictures, and I got to talk to a lot of people. So I received a lot of love from my classmates from Blackfoot High School in the same time frame. So I've been overwhelmed, to say the least. The best part of it is the time to heal gives you time to reflect. And my reflection is that I am looking forward to my future. I intend to have my own comprehensive strategic plan for Chris Taylor, but it'll kind of follow the same thing we're doing in the school system, right? It's going to be very much broader based, comprehensive, and I look forward to developing it and then living it. Just as I look forward to watching the progress that we've made continue as we move forward. The last thing I want to say is this. I have never worked with a school superintendent with as much integrity as Dr. Summers. Now, I'll admit there's only been 2. However, I'm going to say it from the context of, from the beginning of the pandemic to today, he has been consistent, reliable, and transparent in following public health guidelines and recommendations. And he's had groups throughout the process attack the positions that the school system has taken. And I guarantee you there's not one voice or one group of voices that's louder than another. I guarantee you there are loud voices across the spectrum. There's as many loud voices today about current procedures as there were 18 months ago when we were using different procedures. They're different voices. My point is I haven't seen Dr. Summers sway. So my last word is to the community of Lewis Palmer School District 38. We're very fortunate to have Dr. Summers as our superintendent. I appreciate the administrative team that he has, the schools and their administrations that support him as well. And I think this board is very fortunate to have such a good, reliable person that has integrity serving as our superintendent. And I'm not going to let you reply other than what you just said. So with that, let's adjourn until October 18th, is it?
Yeah.
It is. At 6 p.m. Thank you.